actually thank God for this opportunity to share from the Word, and I am also thankful that the pastor gave me a chance. I know he had been talking about endurance this last couple of weeks, and the last week he talked about for the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. Today we're going to look in the Old Testament. There's a story about endurance which you wouldn't think there is in that particular chapter. I have read this story, I have read this chapter so many times, yet I have just the story has gone past my mind, and I have never thought about it as a story of endurance. However, recently in the light of the events and in the light of what the Lord is doing in my heart, I had a chance to read this again. And I thought this is a good example of endurance from the Old Testament. And I am especially an Old Testament girl, given a chance between New Testament and Old Testament. He would pick up New Testament to preach, and I would go back to Old Testament and find a typology or a story and apply it to our situations. Anyway, so last week Abigail came to me saying, "Mom, I heard in the radio, did you know that officially California is out of drought?" I know we have all had this wet winter, right? And it was such an inconvenience and such a nuisance, ruining our plans for the weekends and the weekdays alike. But the good thing that happened is, for the first time in 7 years, California is officially out of drought. So storms have filled the reservoirs and built snowpack and improved soil moisture, and the farmers were looking forward to it. And although we were not prepared for such a great wet winter, and I was reading a little bit about California weather, and interestingly I found that California weather is a Mediterranean climate pattern. That was strange, I thought, because you hear about famines and drought in the scriptures in the Near Eastern times, where you read in the Old Testament, you read about these droughts and famines, and apparently California has a Mediterranean weather pattern. And it leads to a lot of unpredictable weather in California. And from the Bible we know a lot of famine stories, of drought and famine that happened around the Mediterranean culture. We have all three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, facing famine and going to a different place. Abraham was hit with famine, Isaac faced famine, and Jacob and his sons faced famine. And around the same time that Jacob and his sons were facing famine, Joseph in Egypt was facing famine too. And you see the story of David facing famine in 2 Samuel chapter 21, and Israelites in the book of Judges faced famine. And you see Naomi and her family packing up and moving to the enemy's land because they were facing famine. You see Elijah facing famine in 1 Kings chapter 18. And interestingly, Elisha faced famine too in 2 Kings chapter 4. So this famine stories all around in the Old Testament. And Prophet Haggai talks about famine in chapter 1. So the famines that Israelites faced were severe. It went on for years and years sometimes. And during famine, interestingly, people change. What was not acceptable during times of plenty becomes acceptable during times of famine. In American history, we read through this time of great starvation when the pioneers first came, and they had this terrible winter, and they couldn't plant any crops, and they had to go through a severe time of famine and starvation, and just I don't know the statistics, but I believe it was 4 out of every 10 dying. I think it was more than that, but and sometimes an entire colony did not make it because of famine. It was that bad, and people resorted to eating things that I cannot mention here because of famine. So what was acceptable during times of plenty, not acceptable during times of plenty, became acceptable during times of famine. And you see the same stories in the Bible too. People eating things that you would never think about. And these stories are mentioned in 2 Kings chapter 4, chapter 6, and Lamentations chapter 4. It is terrible, and it is something that we cannot comprehend in our minds right now. But God does not waste famines. He has never wasted famines in the lives of His children in the Old Testament. And He's not starting to waste famines even now. Because that brings me to my first point. The steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. Slide 2. The steps of the righteous are ordained by the Lord. Psalm 37 verse 23 says, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord, and he delights in his way. Now let me tell you, there is no reckless fate. There is no accidental mishaps. There is no unknown oopsies or fickle chances happening in our lives. The very uninteresting thing that we consider right now as famine in our life, an unmet need or an unanswered prayer that has been going on for a long time, God is a God who engages with those uninteresting, unmet, unanswered needs in our life. So God never wastes famines, and these are placed by a faithful Father in our lives. Famine is a prolonged, if I were to define famine, slide 3. If I were to define famine, I would say that famine is a prolonged state of hunger or unmet need with a failure to experience satisfaction. You look into our lives, we can all see a famine, and especially in this city, like we discussed earlier, we see a lot of people who are facing this right now. An unmet need with a failure to experience satisfaction. Now, unmet needs, dry seasons, unanswered prayers, spiritual weariness, unfruitful ministry, prolonged joblessness, and poverty. These are some of the examples where we can say and where we can see famine in a figurative sense. So we can look at our lives and say, yes, that is a famine that is going on in my life. Famines reveal our hunger, and they show our need and unravel our inclinations. But the best thing is that God protects and provides for His faithful ones during famine. You see the examples of God coming through in times of famine in the lives of Job. In Job chapter 5 verse 20, Job talks about God coming through. In Psalm 33, 18 to 19, God comes through and rescues His people during times of famine. Proverbs chapter 10 verse 3 talks about God coming through to rescue His people during famine. And one such amazing story of provision is given in Genesis chapter 26, and this is the life of Isaac. Now, we have heard about God saying, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and God of Jacob. And you know that Isaac is this famous patriarch. And he's there on par with Abraham and Jacob. But the interesting thing about Isaac is that he is the quieter one of all three. You don't hear much about him. You hear these chapters written about Abraham and these chapters written about Jacob and his achievements, and nothing much about Isaac. And somebody said about Isaac like this: he is the ordinary son of a great father, and he is the ordinary father of a great son. So you see, he's always lived in the shadows of both these great men, Abraham his father and Jacob his son. And if Abraham was an overachiever and Jacob was a passive deceiver, here he was, our Isaac, a simple perseverer. He was known for his perseverance. He was known for his endurance. And not much of an overachiever like Abraham, who left his land and who traveled all this place and who came to the promised land. Or like Jacob, who used his manipulative techniques and scheming to, he was kind of like a passive-aggressive deceiver, I can say, in his early days. And Jacob was a perseverer. So he was a man who lived in the shadows. You have 14 chapters written about Abraham. You have 12 chapters written about Jacob. But a handful of chapters written about Isaac. And most of the time, even when it is about him, he's in the shadow of either Abraham or his wife Rebecca or even his son Jacob. So you cannot single him out in any chapters except in Genesis chapter 26. That is the story of this great man who is doing certain things here. And interestingly, there is this place that I read that Isaac lived to be 180 years old. That's more than his father or his son. There you have him, You have this man of endurance and the man of perseverance making it to 180 years, and he outlasted his father or his son's years. So persevering and enduring and outlasting seems to be the pattern of Isaac's life. And you come to Genesis 26. It begins with this verse. Now there was a famine. Now there was a famine. And then you see that he was going to go to this new place. That new place is called Gerar. He goes to this new place, Gerar, and the king there is Abimelech. And the Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Stay in the land of which I shall tell you. Sojourn in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I will give all these lands, and I will establish the oath which I swore to your father Abraham. I will multiply your descendants as stars of heaven, and will give you descendants of all these lands. And by your descendants all the nations of earth shall be blessed. And because Abraham obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws, and so Isaac lived in Gerar." So you have here Isaac hearing the voice of God in the time of famine. Interestingly, there are only 2 times Isaac heard God's voice compared to the many times that Abraham heard. Compared to the many times that Jacob heard, Isaac hears God's voice only twice. And one of them is when he initially met with this famine. And it was in Gerar, and scholars say that it was in Gerar that Isaac was conceived. Abraham and Sarah conceived Isaac in the time when they lived in Gerar. And interestingly, you also see a parallel between Abraham's life and Isaac's life in this chapter. Now, Abraham had been to Gerar. Abraham had dug wells there. Abraham deceived Abimelech, the king of Gerar, saying, "Sarah is my sister." Abraham deceived the king, and Abraham dug wells there. And you see the same stories repeated in his son's life. So you have like here, like son, like father, a repetition or a parallel happening here. Isaac goes to Gerar. Isaac meets Abimelech, but Abimelech is the name of a family or a dynasty. It's not necessarily the same Abimelech that Abraham met. And Isaac deceives Abimelech, saying, "Rebekah is my sister." So you have Isaac repeating the same mistake that his father Abraham did. And Isaac also digs well and does business in Gerar. And so you have, Isaac repeating all these things in Gerar. But our point is not, I'm not going there or talking about Isaac's mistakes or how he does repeat all these things that his father did. That is not our point. What I wanted to tell you is I wanted to bring you back is to the point that in times of famine, Abraham hears God's voice. It is in this fellowship that he has with God, he makes certain decisions during this time of famine. So, Isaac hears the voice of God in famine, he had fellowship with God in famine, and he obeys the voice of God in his famine. Isaac's story teaches us that famines fuels us to have fellowship with the fullness of God. Slide 4. If we are to survive a famine, we have to fellowship with God who allowed this famine in our lives. Now, famines are the same things that fuels us. They are the footsteps that takes us to the fullness of God. We have to see famines in the light of the fellowship that God is willing to provide for us. Now, verse 12 through 14 says, Isaac sowed in that land. Now, Isaac is not staying idle. Isaac is sowing, and Isaac is becoming very prosperous in this land. Verse 12 through 14 says, Now Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold. Now remember, famine is going around, but he is reaping 100-fold. And the Lord had blessed him. He had obeyed the voice of God to stay there and not go to Egypt. He was very careful in listening and obeying, and the Lord had blessed him. And the man became rich and continued to grow richer until he became very wealthy. For he had possessions of flocks and herds and a great household, so that the Philistines envied him. Verse 14 says, the Philistines envied him. Now, have you been in situations where you had this abundant prosperity? Whatever you touched just prospered. You wrote this project and it got published. You worked in this field and amazing feedback. And, you thought you were going to get a promotion to the point that things were coming at you. You thought you were going to get a promotion. But you were shown the door. You were asked out. You were asked to go out, and you were thrown out because of envy and backstabbing. I don't know about you. If you had been in this situation, you might understand what Isaac went through. When Abimelech says to Isaac in verse 16, you have become too powerful for us. Please go away from us. In verse 16, Isaac is shown the door and escorted out of the city that he took refuge in. So basically now he is out of Gerar. And this is confusing because God told him not to go to Egypt but stay in this land. God told him that in this land I will bless you. And God told him that, you obey me, and just like your father obeyed, if you obey, I will bless you. And God had indeed blessed him and he prospered. Yet, he is thrown out of the city. I want you to remember that when these things happen, these are the stops also. Just like the steps of the righteous were ordained by the Lord, or ordered by the Lord, God sometimes allows stops in the righteous lives too. Stops of the righteous are ordained by the Lord as well. Slide 5. Isaac has proved to be good at two things till now. He has proved himself to being prosperous, to becoming prosperous in doing his work, finding water, and also he has proved himself something else to be good at. He is good at finding and gaining enemies. So two things, he has shown himself to be good at is finding water and gaining enemies. And this will continue through his life, this pattern. Now success sometimes comes with its territory of envy. Not only was Isaac given guidance by the Lord in famine, the Lord also leads him to some conflicts and some stops along the way. We already saw that Isaac was kicked out of Gerar. Now in verse 15, we read that envy was not only the problem for the people in Gerar. The people in Gerar had some other problem. Whenever they find a well that had been dug by somebody who is not among them, someone who had come from a different place, they would go and fill that well with mud or dirt. They would go and stop that well. They go and ruin that well with dirt. Now verse 15 says, now all the wells his father's servant had dug in the days of Abraham his father, the Philistines stopped by filling them with earth. When an ancient Jew digs a well, it says that it was not only for their present needs, but it was for their generations. The ancient Jews in their times, when they dug well, they saw their generations going to be benefited. They saw their family name inherited through that well. In fact, some of the wells were known by the person who dug it. You have the Samaritan woman who tells Jesus, who comes to draw water from the well of Jacob, right? From the wells of Jacob. From the well of Jacob. So, they give their names, and it is for generations, and it is kind of like a legacy for them to dig a well. And what we see here is that stopping the well by filling up dirt is open and declared warfare. It is warfare against anybody who comes and takes a claim or starts a legacy in their land. They are basically saying, we're not going to let you take roots here and become mighty at our expense. In fact, this is what Abimelech tells him, go away from us, you have become too prosperous for us. And you see that same attitude in Pharaoh when Pharaoh says, these Israelites are becoming too numerous, let's take out their baby boys. And putting dirt and filling up well that was dug for generations is ruining your name, your legacy, your identity. Everything that reminded Isaac of his heritage, of his calling, of his destiny was linked to that well that Abraham had dug. Now, the people of the land has declared war against it, and talk about stops of life, right? But we know that just like the steps of the righteous were ordained by the Lord, stops of the righteous are also ordered by the Lord. Now, Isaac does something amazing here. Let's read verse 18. We see that Isaac dug again the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, for the Philistines had stopped them up. He proceeds to re-dig the wells of water which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. He didn't care that the Philistines had stopped them. He didn't care that dirt had been put into it. But he puts his hand to work and he starts to claim some of his identity or his heritage that the father had left behind. When his identity and legacy was declared war against and taken away from Isaac, he digs deeper to find water. Now, I just want to bring a parallel in. Water in the Bible stands for truth. You have in the book of Ezekiel, the prophet is shown this vision that water proceeds out from the threshold of the temple. It takes him, the prophet walks into it, he gets his ankle wet. He goes down deeper into his knees, until his knees become wet. Then his hip becomes wet, and then the whole water kind of like, carries him. It becomes too powerful for him to resist, and he's carried in that water. And water stands for truth. You have Jesus telling the Samaritan woman that, from those who drink this water, they will never thirst again. So water in the Bible stands for truth. And in Isaiah chapter 12 verse 3 says, with joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. What is this wells of salvation, and what is the water that you're drawing out? It is truth that you're drawing out from the wells of salvation. If water stands for truth, dirt stands for lies. Dirt stands for lies that the evil one can bring into our lives. He throws mud at truth. He covers up the well of salvation with dirt. He does not allow you to profit out of your legacy or your heritage that the Father has given you or prepared for you. He's against you using them, and he ruins it. And the same Philistine spirit existed in the religious system of Jesus' day. And Jesus says in Matthew 23 verse 30, but woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites, for you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. You see how they shut up the kingdom of men. And you see how the people in Gerar ruins and shuts up the wells of the father Abraham had dug. We learn from Isaac what to do when this happens in our lives. Isaac digs deeper, and Isaac, every time Isaac digs deeper, he finds water. He finds new water, and he keeps on finding water. It doesn't matter what they're doing, but he digs and he finds water. And Psalm 37 verse 3 says, dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Do not fret. Do not be envious like the people in Gerar. Do not become envious. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. And we see Isaac here dwelling in the land and continuing to cultivate truth. It's like this. The more they put mud on his heritage and identity, the more he digged deeper and he found truth. So Isaac was thrown out of Gerar. He proceeds to a nearby valley and he digs again. And he finds water at a new place. Guess what the shepherds of the land do? The shepherds of the land quarrels over that well that Isaac digs. They said, the water is ours. Gerar, we have a problem. I will take your father's wells. I will put mud on it. I will take your newly redug wells, and I will claim it for myself. Does that sound like someone that you know, that you have encountered? Jesus tells a parable of the sower and how the sower sowed the seeds. And as the farmer is sowing the seeds, we see that the seeds are being taken away. We see the enemy choking the seeds. And from ancient times, our enemy Satan, he does not like anyone finding truth, finding water. So Isaac understands that now the new water that he found had been claimed by the shepherds of the land, saying this is their water. He names that well Esek. He gives a name to that well. He names it Esek, which means strife or contention. And he decides to move on. He says, okay, now this is claimed and this is taken. I'm not going to be worrying about it. I'm going to move on. You know why Isaac can say that? Because a man is good at finding water again. This is his skill. This is his efficiency. He can go, he can dig, and he knows he will find, God will bless him and will find water again. So the man moves on, and he comes to a new place. And this time, you can imagine that, what would have happened. So in verse 21, he digs a new well. And guess what happens? The shepherd man comes. They claim that well also. They say, this is our water, okay? We agree that you worked. We agree that you put some investment into it, but the land is still ours. So the water is ours. And they quarreled over that well too. And this time, the game actually steps up. But because we see that Isaac named that well accusation. In other words, Isaac named that well Sitna. Sitna means accusations. So they stepped up their game. You see how it was envy at Gerar? It was arguments or strife or contention at Esek. But right now, the game has stepped up. It is accusations. What was conceived as envy delivers strife and then grows accusation. So envy closed the doors of Gerar fellowship. Contention closed the doors at Esek fellowship. And now, despite his faithfulness and hard work to the Lord, the doors of Sitna fellowship are closing once again. If the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord, and the stops of the righteous are ordained by the Lord, Isaac knows that this is no big deal. So what does Isaac do? The man is a perseverer. He's not an adventurer or an overachiever or a deceiver. He is a perseverer, and he moves on and he decides to dig again. Now let me ask you, if you had started 3 businesses and poured your life into them, and 3 times you failed, 3 times you were shown the door, attacked, sidelined and benched, and treated unfairly, would you even try to start a 4th business? Would you even try to put your investment into something a 4th time? You know, there's a proverb in India that says a cat that was burnt with hot milk will not even come close to buttermilk. You know, it is scared for life. It is burnt for life. It's not going to come and try even buttermilk. So, you know, that's kind of like a question that we need to ask ourselves. But we have an example in Isaac here, who is a perseverer. He moves on. And in slide 7, we see that the sufficiency of the righteous are centered in the Lord. So we learned that the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. You have famine and you have these frustrations, and you come back to stops of the righteous are ordained by the Lord. And you see a couple of stops. You see that he was stopped at Cherian, he was stopped at Esek, he was stopped at Sitnah. You come back to understand in the next portion that the sufficiency of the righteous are centered in the Lord. Isaac let them have Esek. Isaac let them have Sitnah. And in verse 22, I want you to read verse 22. Genesis chapter 26, verse 22, it says, he moved away from there. The first 2 times, or even the 3rd time, you don't see moved away. All you see is that he moved and started another well. He moved and dug another well. He moved and dug another well. But in verse 22, it says, he moved away from there. That's the first time that he's moving away. Until now, he was just moving and digging, moving and digging. Psalm 120, verse 5 and 6 says, sharp arrows from the warrior with burning coals of juniper. Woe to me that I dwell in Mesech, that I live among the tents of Kedar. Too long have I dwelt among those who hate peace. I am in favor of peace, but when I speak, they want war. When I first read this chapter in Psalm 120, when I first read verses 5 and 6, I thought, why does the psalmist have to dwell among those who hate peace? Why does he, when he is in favor of peace and they declare war on him, why can't he move out? And this was a question that plagued my mind, you know, where you have to dwell. There are certain times when Lord allows stops in our lives and we are in certain places where there is war and contention and strife, and there are certain times when we have to move away from there. And one of those times for Isaac is this, that he moves away from there. Sometimes God brings stops in our lives so we can move on to new pastures. Other times we need to move away from strifes and accusations. Isaac here moves away from contention, moves away from accusations, and he moved away from there. He dug another well. You know the drill of Isaac digging the well. No pun intended. The drill of Isaac digging the well. He is going to find water again. He's going to find water again. So here we have Isaac dug the 4th time or the 3rd time, and this is the first he was out of Cherian, and then Esek, then Sitnah, and now he is in this new place where he moved away from Sitnah and Esek. And in verse 22 it says, he found water and they did not quarrel over it. So he named it Rehoboth, for he said, at last the Lord has made room for us and we will be faithful in the land. This is verse 22 that says, at last the Lord has made room for us and we will be faithful in the land. You need to overcome the enemy of jealousy, the enemy of contention, the enemy of accusations before you come to fruitfulness. Before you come to fruitfulness, there are certain enemies that we need to overcome, that we need to outlast. Isaac's story is a story of outlasting his enemies. You see, children of God, there is a time that, the children of God outlast the enemies of God. And it is done by endurance and perseverance. There is an outlast. There is an at last for those who outlast. Like Isaac here is saying, at last the Lord has made room for us. So there is an at last for those who outlast. And Isaac's story is one of endurance, one of perseverance, where he outlasted his enemies. The enemy got fed up and gave up and said, we're not going to quarrel over that now, you can have it. He outlasted his enemies. Isaiah 41 verse 12, my favorite verse, it says, behold, all who rage against you shall be ashamed and disgraced. Those who contend with you will be reduced to nothing and will perish. You will seek them but will not find them. Those who wage war against you will come to nothing. We need to outlast our enemies by endurance. There is a time for stops, but your sufficiency is centered in the Lord who brings you to broad places. And a second, sit now at places of work, investing, finding water, releasing, giving away, and you are not allowed to drink of that work. You were not allowed to drink of that work. You seem to be turning in your wages faster than finding them. You were signing away checks more than the income that came in. And you guys, some of you know what I'm talking about. In Psalms 18, David had the same experience, and David says, after he was hunted down like a partridge, after he had gone through all that persecution, finally he says, the Lord brought me forth into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. Rehoboth is your place of fruitfulness. We can relate this back to when Israelites inherited their promised land that God promised them. And God said, for I will cast out the nations before thee and enlarge thy borders. There you have the word again, enlarging, or broad places, or making room for us. Neither shall any man desire thy land, for when thou shalt go up to appear before the Lord thy God thrice in the year. Isaac had been escorted and shown the door 3 times, but he endured, he persevered, put his hand to work again. Those who show you the door ajar and takes away your Esek and claims your Sidna, let me tell you, dear children of God, they cannot outlast your faith. They cannot outlast your endurance. They cannot outlast your perseverance when you make it by grace to Rehoboth. When you make it by grace to a place of fruitfulness, it is, you will look around and you will not see the enemy. I want to move on to the place of fruitfulness and Rehoboth. And there is one more step where Isaac goes up to, and that is to Beersheba. You see that, he did not stop with Rehoboth. He moved to Beersheba. I want to talk about that and talk about the fullness of God, and we will look at it next week. But right now, I want to remind you that when we started the chapter, we started saying, now there was a famine in the land. And right now we are at Rehoboth, and it says, at last the Lord, and he says, at last the Lord made room for us. Whatever is going on in your life right now, whatever is going on in the life of those whom you know are going through a famine or a drought, I want you to remind yourself and remind them that there is an at last for those who outlast. There is an at last for those times of famine that are happening now in your life. So remember, the steps of the righteous are ordered by the Lord. The stops of the righteous are ordained by the Lord. And the sufficiency of the righteous is centered in the Lord. There is a song that has spoken to us numerous times. It is by Toby Mac. It's a little upbeat song. And we have been encouraged so many times when he says, move, keep walking. And that's what we see Isaac doing here. He moved. He did not go back and quarrel and get it back. He did not, get into contention and strife and make it worse. He kept moving as the enemy kept claiming, and he finally outlasted the enemy. And at last, when the enemy couldn't outlast him, God has brought him to broad places. God brought him to fruitfulness. And I pray that over our church, that our church would be a place where people learn to outlast the enemy. That we would have, by grace, the endurance to outlast the enemies that bring havoc and destruction and famine into our lives. Now, whatever famine that you are going through today, I pray that the Spirit of God would help you to endure. Spirit of God would help us to outlast. The Spirit of the same Spirit that helped Isaac to stay, to obey the voice of God would bring us into deeper obedience. You know what? We are good at finding truth. We're good at digging and finding truth, and that truth nobody can take away from us. They might throw dirt at your legacy. They might throw dirt at your identity. They might throw dirt. The enemy is good at that. He sows weeds where the farmer sows seeds. and he chokes and he takes away the seeds. He might put dirt into many of your heritage, your destiny, your identity. But he's not good, and he's not good at outlasting. Our God comes for us with the spirit of endurance and says, you endure and you will come into Rabbah and places of fruitfulness. May the Lord bless you.
Yeah.
Another heartbreak day. Feels like you're miles away. Don't even need no shade when the sun don't shine. Too many passing dreams roll by like memories. It's hard to keep your lead and back to the vibe. I know your heart been broke again. I know your prayers ain't been answered yet. I know you're feeling like you're running with them, but they know yet. So move, keep walking. Soldier, keep moving on. Move, keep walking until the morning comes. Move, keep walking. Soldier, keep moving on and lift your head. They know yet. Echoing inside your head. Words that your sweet mama said. Shoot for the moon, dear. Sing thinking on inside your bed. Between my sticks and from face. Thinking that you can vibrate. I can hold your hand, but I can't turn your ass to freedom. I know your heart been broke again. Soldier, keep moving on, move, keep walking until the morning comes. Move, keep walking. Soldier, keep moving on and lift your head. It ain't over yet. Hold on, the Lord ain't finished yet. Hold on, He'll get you through this. Hold on, these are the promises I never will forget. So hold on, the Lord ain't finished yet. Hold on, He'll get you through this. Hold on, these are the promises I never will forget. I know your heart been broke again. I know your prayers ain't been answered yet.